Hello, my name is Jaden Ginsberg. I will be reading to you The Marrow Thieves. This will be the only known Marrow Thieves audiobook on YouTube. Let's get straight into it. First chapter is called Frenchie's Coming To Story. Mitch was smiling so big his big black teeth shone in the soft light of the solar-powered lamp we'd scavenged from someone's shed. Check it out. He held a bag of Doritos between us. A big bag, too. Holy Mitch, where do you get that? I touched the air-pressurized bag to confirm it was real. My dirty fingers skittered across the shiny surface like skates. It was real. My mouth filled with spit, and a rotten hole in one of my molars yelled its displeasure. In the last house back there, hidden on top of the cupboard, like Ma used to do when she didn't want us getting into stuff. Mom had only been gone a few months, so talking about her still stung. My brother popped that bag to cover our hurt. And like cheese-scented fireworks, that loud release of air and pressurized dust cheered us up. We were in a treehouse somewhere on the outer rim of a small city that had long been closed down like a forgotten convenience store. We were a few hours out from southern metropolitan city, which used to be Toronto back when there were still so many cities. They each had a unique name instead of a direction. West City, Northeast Metropolis, Southern Township. It was a great treehouse. Some lucky kid must have had a contractor for a father. It was easily 2 stories up from the unmown lawn. We had a gabbled roof with real shingles. We'd been there for 3 days now, skipping school, hiding out, before he left with the council and we never saw him again. Dad had taught us that the best way to hide is to keep moving. But this spring had been damp. It rained off and on for over a week. We couldn't resist the dry comfort of the one-room treehouse with built-in benches. Besides, we reasoned, it was up high like a sniper hole, so we could see if anyone was coming for us. It probably started with that first pop of air against metallic plastic, no louder than a champagne cork. I imagined the school truancy officers, recruiters, we called them, coming for us. Noses to the wind, sunglasses reflecting the row of houses behind which we nestled in our wooden dream home. And sure enough, by the time we'd crunched through the first sweet, salty handfuls, they were rounding the house into the backyard. Shit. What? Mitch put the bag down and turned the window cut into the north wall. Francis, you're gonna have to listen to me really carefully. What? I knew it was bad. He never called me Francis. No one but my mom ever did. And then only when I was in trouble. I'd been Frenchy since I could remember. Listen now. He turned away from the window to lock eyes with me. You're gonna climb out the back window and onto the roof, as low down as you can get. But Mitch, I can't climb out a window. Yes, you can. And you will. You're the best damn climber there is. Then, when you're on the roof, you're gonna grab the pine tree behind us and climb up into it. Stay as close to the trunk as you can. You have to shimmy into the back part, where the shadows are the thickest. You go first. Too late, buddy. They know someone's up here. Just not how many someones. I felt my throat tighten to a pinhole. This is how voices are squeezed to a hysterical screeching. Mitch, no. He turned again, eyes burning with purpose, bordering on anger. Now move it, Francis. I couldn't have him mad at me. He was all I had left. I clambered out the window and folded upward to grasp the slats on the roof. I shimmied up, belly to the wood, butt pulled down tight. Lifted my head once, just high enough to look over the small peak in the center. Just enough to see the first recruiter lift a whistle to his mouth, inserted under his sandy mustache, and blow that high-pitched terror tone from our nightmares. Under the roof, I heard Mitch start banging the plywood walls, screaming, "Tabernacle! Come get me, devils!" Fear launched me into the pine. The hairy knots on the sticky trunk scraped my thighs, sweat and skin holding me there. The needles poked into my arms and shoved me into my armpits, making me tear up. I pulled my sweaty body towards the other side of the pine, scrapes popping up red and puffy on my thighs and torso. All the while, the whistles, two now, blew into the yard. Come get me, morons! Yeah, bro. I saw both of the recruiters now. High-waisted navy shorts, gym socks with red stripes pulled up to their knees above low mesh-sided sneakers, the kind that make you look fast and professional. Their polo shirts were partially covered with zip-front windbreakers, one shade lighter than their shorts. The logo on the left side was unreadable from this distance, but I knew what it said. I saw both of the recruiters now. I knew what it said. Government of Canada, Department of One Irology, around their necks, hanging on white cords, those silver whistles. Mitch was carrying on like a madman into the treehouse, yelling while they dragged him down the ladder and onto the grass. I heard a bone snap like a young branch. He yelled when they each grabbed an arm and began pulling. He yelled around the house, into the front yard, and into the van, covering all sounds of a small escape in the trees. Then the door slid shut, and an engine clicked on and whirred to life, and I was alone. I wanted to let go. I wanted to take my arms off the trunk, fold them to my chest like a mummy, loosen my thighs from their grip and fall a backward swan dive to the bottom. I pulled one hand back and clutched the opposite shoulder. Deep breath, you can do this. The other hand shook as it began to release. The skin of my thighs burned with the extra strain. Soon, they too would be unclenched. Deep breath. If I survived the fall, which was possible, I'd be taken to the school with Mitch. This thought was appealing at first, and for a brief moment, I had some kind of a TV reunion in my head. Me, Mitch, Mom, Dad, but I knew that's not how it would go. A few had escaped from the schools, and the stories they told were anything but heartwarming. There's a man named Miguans who came by council last night. My father had said one night when we were still together, he escaped from one of the satellite schools, the one up by the lake. Dad had bags under his eyes. He'd gathered us around the kitchen table to talk, but spoke haltingly, like he's rather not. He told us about what's happening to our people. It wasn't easy to hear, and he was frantic. Tried to leave right away, looking for the Isaac fellow. Gene, maybe the boys should go in the other room for this. Miguan said the governor's committee didn't set up the schools brand new. He said they were based on the old residential school system they used to try to break our people to begin with, way back. He paused and drank half the liquid in his greasy glass, a kind of moonshine he kept in an old pop bottle on the back stoop. He placed it hard on the picnic table. We hauled into the main room of the cabin. The glass echoed the wood in its hollow curve. It was punctuation. It made me jump. He was in the gloomy place he went to when he spoke about how the world had changed. He said we were lucky we didn't remember how it had been, so we had less to mourn. I believed him. Okay, boys, that's it. Off to bed. Mom shooed us off the bench, pushing us out the door before we could formulate an argument to stay. Dad stopped me to kiss the top of my head, and I felt safe, even just for a minute. We heard Mom crying as we lay in bed that night, and the next day we packed up the small cottage we'd been staying in since our apartment in the city had lost power. Things had gotten dangerous. We haven't even spent a full year there. None of us were keen on leaving, especially me and Mitch. We had family here, blood and otherwise. There were other families, people like us, who had settled here. The old people called it the New Year's Road Allowance. The New Road Allowance. And now we were jamming clothes and jars of preservatives wrapped in blankets into our duffel bags to move again. I thought about our walk into this settlement from the city. We walked north. Dad had said then, north is where the others will head. We'll spend a season up by the Bay Zone. We'll hole up in one of those cabins up there and I'll try to find others. We'll find our way, Frenchie. And up north is where we'll find a home. For sure? Hell's yes, for sure. I know so because we're going to make a home there. If you make something happen, then you can count on it being for sure. What will you find up there, Dad? I'd been nervous it would be all empty and wet, the constant rain making pools in our footprints before we could completely empty them of our feet. I was tired and hungry, and my shoes were as thin as cardboard, but I tried not to let any of that color my voice when I spoke. I knew we were all tired and hungry, and trudging along on leather-skinned shoes, I knew to be positive in that way that a little kid comes home from school and can tell there's been an argument that day by the way the air smells in the front hall, decides this is the day he'll start his math homework without being asked. Survival, I guess. We were out by Old Highway 11, having slipped the noose of the last suburb of East City. Unlike the smaller city outskirts where I'd lose my brother, these suburbs were open and vast, a maze of darkened windows and burnt cars and kaleidoscope boroughs that branched out like a geometric blossom of asphalt and curb and erupting driveways. I felt kind of special then, before I knew how dangerous special could be. I guess I was proud of my family with our ragged shoes and stringy hair. We were still kings among men. I held my twiggy walking stick like a scepter, chin tilted towards the ashy sky. And now here we were again, getting ready for another journey into another unknown, driven by fear. But we never made that move, not together anyway. Well, it was supposed to be my father's last council meeting before he took his family north. It was decided they'd make one last-ditch effort to talk to the governors in the capital. They never came back. I knew I'd never see my family if I were captured. We wouldn't be reunited at the school. I had to get down from this tree safely and keep on moving. Mitch had sacrificed himself so I could live. So I had to live. It was the only thing left I could do for him. I pulled myself back against the tree, hugging the cracky trunk so hard I had tectonic imprints on my cheek and thighs for 3 days after. I stayed there until the van drove off, until I couldn't hear the engine anymore, until the day filled up with gray, until the gray turned indigo. Then I shook each sleepy limb, each screaming muscle back into service, and half slid, half climbed down back the tree to the ground. The landing vibrated into my shins and set my kneecaps loose like baby teeth. Sat there a moment before the memory of the shrill siren of the recruiter's whistle shoved under my feet like silvers. I was almost to the house next door before I remembered to turn my back for the half-eaten bag of chips. The first night I kept going, running when I could, crawling against every surface that offered a shadow. I even pissed on the run, dribbling on my duct tape boot. The morning after, when I was truly alone in the bright of day, it was all panic and adrenaline. I found a rain barrel behind a small detached bungalow at the end of a cul-de-sac somewhere by the outlet mall, and drank as much water as I could. Then, right away, threw most of it back up. At least my boot was clean again. Here, the sidewalks were shot through with arterial cracks and studded with menacing weeds that had evolved into torrential rain and the lack of pollinators. Wildlife was limited to buzzards, raccoons the size of huskies, domestic pets left to run feral, and hordes of cockroaches that had regained the ability to fly like their southern cousins. I had been scared of them all when I was still running with my brother. Now, in the wake of his removal, they were nothing. I crunched over lines of roaches like sloppy gravel, threw rocks at the park at the pack of guinea pigs grunting at me with prehistoric teeth from under their protective awning at a corner grocery. "No one cares, you little shit," I screamed at the largest male, who stood his ground on the outer perimeter of the awning, stomping his boundary on surprisingly muscular front legs like some kind of caricature of an old bulldog. Behind him huddled his nuclear family, a circle of 2 smaller females and about 18 buck-toothed guinea pig children. "We're all dead anyway. I can make a shish kebab of your kids." I didn't mean it. I looked at their round eyes, wet and watching but not nervous enough for the threat of a human. Their dad was there after all. They knew they were safe. I felt tears collecting behind my own eyes like sand in a windstorm. I opened my mouth. To say what? To apologize to a group of wild guinea pigs? To explain that I hadn't meant what I had said? To let them know I just missed my family? A small sob escaped instead. I cupped a dirty hand over my mouth, to catch it, but not before the male smelled my fear and turned his back to me. I was no danger to them. I was no danger to anything. At best, I was prey. It was early evening when I hit the edge of the trees. According to the small plastic compass clipped onto the zipper of my backpack, I was now heading northeast. Dad had said we should head north to the old lands. We told Mom we were heading east when we lost her at the seniors' home. I figured northeast was the safest bet. Now I was alone, leaving the smaller cities that had winked out long ago like Christmas lights on a faulty wire. The trees here were still tall, so I wasn't very far north, but they weren't dense, so I wasn't too south anymore either. My legs screamed for a night and day of ache and stretch marinated in old adrenaline scabbed me with tree barks. I collapsed under a pine. It was still spring, and I knew the night would be too cold for a single boy with no real shelter other than a thermal wrap and a couple layers of hoodies. The early moisture would set in, and I couldn't afford to get sick, so I built a modest fire just big enough to cut the chill and lay on my back, backpack under my head. Out here, stars were perforations, revealing the bleached skeleton of the universe through a collection of tiny holes. And surrounded by these silent trees besides a calming fire, I watched the bones dance. This was our medicine, these bones. And I opened up and took it all in. All dreamed of north. Cold is an effective alarm, and I was up before the sun. The fire had gone out, but not long ago, since there was still smoke. The cough I'd been cultivating over the past few days was more insistent now. I coughed, and each push of air brought a fresh ache out of my neck, and my back, and my legs. The jump and the run had really done a number. Still, I stood and started my jumping jacks, following Mitch's morning warm-up routine, even though he wasn't there to motivate me. Come on, French, I've seen higher from a boulder. I rolled up my sweats and the wrap and jammed them into my backpack before a quick breakfast of the second-to-last tin of meal replacement drink and a granola bar with a bite already missing. My stomach grumbled when I finished, but there was maybe a day and a half of food supplies left in my pack, and I was heading into the woods. There'd be no grocery stores or abandoned duplexes to raid for leftovers and non-perishables. I wasn't quite sure how I would do it. Mom had said her uncles and grandpa were great hunters, that it was a family trait. Maybe it would just come to me, like a blood memory or something. What would I even kill an animal with? A stick? I started back north, keeping my eyes to the ground for animal tracks with no idea of what I would do if I actually saw some, or if I would even recognize what animal made them. By the time the sun reached center stage, a punctuation mark in the cloud-lined sky, I was miles into the woods. The trees were denser, the ground less manageable, and the wildlife, judging by the sounds and smells around me, had changed. I stopped in a small clearing filled with tall grasses and low bush. It was the thud of my heart against the hollow bowl of my stomach that made me eat a cluster of dandelion weeds grown to waist height. They weren't bad. I added them to my available and edible list and clomped on, the plastic compass pressed into my palm now like a toy talisman. I kept trudging north. You have to try to keep the goal in your head. You can't let what's not here, what's missing, you can't let that slow you down. Mom was trying hard to give us a pep talk on top of the seniors' home in a small city on our last night as a trio. But with a monotone voice and that far-off look she'd taken on since Dad had left with the lost council, it was hard to take in the message. Her words fell in between the sheets of rain like downed planes. Defeated. Useless. Mom, here. Mitch held an open can of artichoke hearts he'd just grilled with a lighter. You need to eat. She ignored him. There were generations in our family where all we did was move. First by choice, then every time the black cars came from town and burned on our homes along the roadside. Now the cars are here again, only now they're white vans, and I can't run that fast. Not fast enough. Never fast enough. Mom, Mitch spoke louder but still gently. I was huddled against the side of the gazebo, peering through the wooden lattice and the lookout for recruiters. You haven't eaten all day. You need to eat. Her eyes stayed fixed, away from her eldest. The smell from the lake here was nauseating. Once this was a popular city, being right on the lake water. Now, this lake, like all the industry plundered Great Lakes, was poison, and a tall fence blocked it off from the overgrown streets. We hadn't been here more than a day, so the smell was pungent for us. We breathed into bandanas and built shelter from the stench with plywood and a tarp. Mitch tried a different tactic with Mom. If you don't eat, you won't have the strength to take the second shift tonight. Something flickered on her face and she reached out, removed one pale heart from the chuster, and inserted it into her mouth like a chore. It was few minutes before she spoke again. We have to move, my boys. Tomorrow we move, after I do one last forage in the old Friendship Center. Mom, no. That place is a hot spot for recruiters. It's a pretty obvious niche magnet. She squinted her eyes. Oh, now? The officers are long done with that place. There's no Indians left in this part of the city anyways. I'm just going to look for a few things we'll need once we get past the city and into the bush. It'll only take me a minute. She reached for our hands and squeezed them, breathing deep and full like a prayer, chewing her bottom lip like a penance. The next day she left, before we reheated artichoke for breakfast. And then Mitch and I were on our own. I was stumbling. Another night asleep in the open. This time I didn't have enough strength to rebuild the fire that had been rained out while I fitfully sleep. My muscles ached, my belly rumbled, and my heart hurt. I tripped over an above-ground root bent like an arthritic finger and picked up a limp. The rain started again just after noon, and I sat under a dense pine nursing my last tin of meal replacement. The last resort tin with the expiry date for the previous year. There was a sour current through the frothy top notes, but it was all that was left. I hadn't even seen any more damn dandelions. My molar screamed every time a swallow of liquid passed over it. Just this morning I had started contemplating dentistry with a rock, or maybe I could just fall out of a tree, cheek first. I fell asleep biting a piece of shoelace leaning against the pine trunk, wishing Mom would find me. A shiver woke me up. It was almost full dark and my tooth hurt and my ankle throbbed and I'd spilled what was left of the tin on the ground besides my legs. Oh no. I righted the tin and shook it. Not even a mouthful left. Damn it. I tried to throw it into the woods to make that damn tin pay for my own carelessness. It arched up and hit the ceiling of pine branches above me, slamming back to the ground not a foot in front of me. I kicked it instead. Jesus! My ankle sang a terrible song, like my toothache had stung my foot. Rot and damp and hopelessness and hunger and fear and anger twisted up in a clamp around my rib cage. I sat back down, picked up the can, and rubbed it across my greasy forehead. Back and forth, back and forth. No one to take care of me now. No one to make me move. Where the hell was I going anyway? Where the hell is my mom? Why did she have to go on to the Friendship Center? Her eyes that night, hollow like an old stump, like the hole in my molar, a true ache. I'm going to die. Saying it out loud was like hearing it from another person's mouth. It made my head well up with tears. I held on to them. Precious water. I decided then that if I was going to die, I wasn't going to sit there and wait for the truancy dicks to come get me. I'd die fighting wild animals, or swan diving from one of these pines, or the starvation half buried in the drying earth like a partially cremated corpse floating down the old Ganges, before the Ganges became a footpath for heartbroken pilgrims. I stood back up, dropped the can, and shouldered my pack. Onward. I fell a couple of times, tripping over roots sticking out from the ground that was ashy and loose in the thinning earth, washed out from the endless rain. I split my lip on the last tumble and tasted wet pennies and heavy perfume. Should have turned my head to hit my tooth, I thought. I laughed out loud, a desperate sound that made me laugh harder, so that I had to stop. hands on my shaking knees, and wade out to the wave of giggles that made it impossible to trudge on. The cough was near constant, stiff and phlegmy, like a sack of bricks slamming against my insides. It made me double over and drool. I broke a blood vessel in my right eye with the hack. The walk was slow with thickness and the limp. I didn't even notice my stomach had pulled itself into a fist until I was being punched by it. Nauseous and cold, and now night was falling. No. I couldn't do anything to protect myself from it, so I whined. Shit, no. I leaned against a knobbly pine sticky with a sap that matted the back of my head in the bark and watched the sky betray me into navy. I slid then, slow and painful, ripping out my hair so that a clump of me stayed pinned to the tree, nesting material for low-flying buzzards. The stars began to rip through the hard skin of the dark like the sharp points of silver, needless through velvet. I watched them appear and wink and fade, and I smiled. This was going to be so bad. Maybe the end is just a dream. That made me feel sorry for a minute for the others, the dreamless ones. What happened when they died? I imagined them just shutting off like factory machines at the end of a shift, functioning, purposeful, and then just out. I closed my eyes, just for a minute. The dream came for me right away. Later, I couldn't recall what it had been or for how long I'd been asleep. But when I woke, it was reluctantly, put him down over there, right close to the fire. He's breathing all funny. Never mind now. Just prop up his head. Wob, go grab that quilt from my bedroll. Ziguan, heat up some water. We'll need to get him some liquid. Voices. Voices with the pulled vowels and cut lilt of my father. Voices with the low music of my mother. I couldn't open my eyes. Not yet. This was too beautiful of a dream, even just in audio. All right now. Pull off his shoes and get his feet close to the pit. I felt tugging and then the relief of a good swell allowed to spread out, then heat. Hey boy, can you hear me? You'll need to drink some of this water. A metal edge split my broken lips and clear, warm water poured into my mouth. I sputtered at first, a reaction to the intrusion. Then the fist in my guts demanded it and my throat opened up in compliance. The need was so great, the satisfaction so complete. I grasped for the vessel, lest it be pulled away. Easy now, easy now. I managed to open one eye. There was a man holding the tin, not my father, but a man with the same crease around his eyes. His hair was long down the middle and shaved close on the sides. He looked to be about my father's age. Over his right shoulder, a girl stared at me with one round, dark eye. Her long hair dripped around her face, flickering into tandem with the flames of the large fire. She handed a blanket to the man, who tucked it around me. Ziguan, get some soup over here. This boy is starved. The man spoon-fed me broth with sweet corn mush until the fist unclenched just enough for me to rest. Then he put it beside me on a flat rock, when you can hold it yourself. That's when you know it's okay for you to eat more without getting sick. I opened both eyes and looked around. There were more people now. There was the man, the older girl who brought the blanket, who I saw was wearing an eye patch and had an angry red slash down her cheek. There was a child not much older than a baby, sleeping in the nest of blankets like a puppy inside an old lady dozing in her kerchief. Then there was a small round boy, two smaller boys who looked like they must be twins, another tall boy whose face was hidden by the shadow of a hood. They all sat around a roaring fire on blankets and sleeping bags, and they seemed to all be native, like me. Behind them were two canvas tents shut tight against the cold air, and the new bugs that had found the blood around my mouth interesting. Who are you? It wasn't more than a whisper. More like, who are you? Who are you? Something like that. It was a man who answered, standing to poke at the branches in the fire. I'm Miguan's. This is my family, but not now. There'll be time for that tomorrow. You need to eat some more of this soup and then sleep. Tomorrow we move. Probably got some recruiters nearby with the racket you were kicking up by yourself out there. Miguan's. I'd heard that name before. I could see my father's mouth pronouncing it with reference, like he did with everything. That a touch of the old about it, the words from our language, like a prayer. North. He turned his face to me, flames animating the shadows that fell there under his eyes, along his cheekbones. Yeah, that's right, north. We seem to be heading in the same direction. Might as well trudge on together then, eh? I didn't answer. The tears cleared away the dirt from my eyes, stinging as they crossed my split lips. Sobs rocked me, open and closed, until I was fatal. I was embarrassed to be so broken in front of all these new Indians. They were embarrassed for me. No one made a motion or mouthed a reproach. They just let me be broken, because soon I wouldn't be anymore. Eventually, I wouldn't be alone either, and maybe tomorrow I'd wake up and find myself closer to home. Well, that's chapter 1. Let's do a quick recap of it. So, the main character, he was called Francis one time in the story, but that was by his brother, like when his brother got taken. So, like, the main character, he tells us about how he lost his mom, how he lost his dad, and the scene in the beginning where he lost his brother. So that was a pretty heavy chapter. He found people. He found people to travel with that are currently helping him. I think he's gonna stick with this group of people for a decent amount of time. I don't know. It's a survival situation, so he might have to do what he has to do, and then he might get broken off from the group. I don't know. We'll see. But I think he's going to stay with this group for a while. That was the end of chapter 1. And chapter 1, what is chapter 1 called? Frenchie's Coming To story. This is chapter 2. This is The Fire. Mig explained it one night at the fire. Dreams get caught in the webs woven in your bones. That's where they live, in that marrow there. He poked at the crackling wood with a pointy stick till the shadows were frantic against his tan face, till they slid into the longer shoots of hair near the front of his mohawk. The tendrils he swept up and patted into place atop the shorter brush with the care of a pageant queen. He didn't make eye contact with us, the motley group seated in a loose semicircle around the fire beneath the trees where he commanded his place. I imagined spiderwebs in my bones and turned my palm towards the moon, watching the ballot of bones between my elbow and wrist twist to make it so. I saw webs clotted with dreams like fat flies. I wondered if the horses I'd been ridden into this dawn were still caught in there, like bugs, whinnying in the shift. Mig nudged the rounded stones placed around the perimeter of the fire with his boot. You could see where the holes in his soul had been patched up with sap and scavenged leather. How did they get in there? Riri, now 7, was always curious and not shy with her questions. You are born with them. Your DNA weaves them into the marrow like spinners, Mig answered. The flames tried to settle, and he reduced them to dance again. He added, that's where they plucked them from. I pulled each one of my fingers into my palm and made a fist silhouetted against the fire, flames licking around the tight ball of brown and bone. I imagined my brother tied to a chair at the school, a flock of gray-hooded villains tightening his beaded chains while they recited Hail Mary like synchronized swimmers. Mig sat satisfied that we were all at attention, that we were listening with every cell. He leaned against a felled tree besides Minerva, who woke up with his rustling. He rolled the smoke out of his precious tobacco stores and plucked a twig out of the fire with a burning ember at the top to light it with. Old Minerva, nearsighted, squinting, lifted her nose at the smell. Her lips fell slack and she sighed. Those First few exhales were big and wasteful, as Mig tried to get the damp paper to light, and smoke billowed across the clearing like messages. Everything was always damp, so we're trained to sniff out mold to keep that sickness at bay. Minerva made her hands into shallow cups and pulled the air over her head and face, making prayers out of ash and smoke. Real old-timey, that Minerva. Mig and Minerva were the only grown-ups in our group. Mig wore his hair shaved to the skull, except down the middle, and had a mustache that only grew on the left side of his top lip. He was tall but bent like a walking stick, like a walking question mark. He was short with words and patience. Mig wore army pants, alternating between two identical pairs and layers of brown and green sweaters. He kept a small pouch hung on a shoelace around his neck and tucked into those sweaters. Once, when I'd asked him, he'd told me that that is where he kept his heart, because it was too dangerous to keep it in his chest, what with the sharp edges of bones so easily broken. I never asked again. Too many metaphors and stories wrapped in stories. It could be exhausting talking to Mig. Minerva was dark, round, and tiny like a tree stump. She kept her long gray hair in two braids like a little girl, with a flowered kerchief tied over her head and under her round chin. She'd had old-timey ways, but you couldn't get much from her either. She didn't talk. When she did, it was in bursts, accompanied by laughter and maybe a scream or two. Mostly, she watched everything. Us kids playing in the river, the way the trees tilted to the north towards what was left of the neutral landscape beyond the clear-cut strip of topsoil. She watched the birds on their perpetual migration to anywhere, the fire at the end of the day, and the way we clapped each other's backs when trading off on the trap lines. There were 7 of us in the group, 5 boys and 2 girls, not including the elders. Not one of us was related by blood, which was a good thing for those closer in age, since in the old days when our families were huge and sprawling, accidentally dating a second or a third cousin had meant you had asked about genealogy right off the bat. But it was also lonely, not having the common connections of grandparents or aunties like we used to have so often. There was Chi-Boy, who at 17 was the oldest boy and taller than anyone else. He was quite almost to the point of being mute and as skinny as a doe. He never seemed to sleep as long as the rest of us or needed as much food. And he stuck close to Mig so that when he was needed, he was no more than 1 syllable away. He came from the west, from the Cree lands. After Chi-Boy there was me, 16. I was nicknamed Frenchie as much for my name as for my people, the Metis. I came from a long line of hunters, trappers, and voyagers, but now with most of the rivers cut into pieces and lakes left as gray sludge puckers on the landscape, my own history seemed like a myth, along the lines of dragons. Compared to Chi-Boy's 6+ feet, I wasn't the tallest, but I did have the longest hair of any of the boys, almost to my waist. Burnt ombre at the untrimmed edges. I braided it myself each morning to keep it out of the way, to remind myself of things I couldn't quite remember, but that, nevertheless, I knew to be true. My clothes were also burnt from the sun and were a molted brown from their original tones of black. Then there were the 12-year-old twins, Tree and Ziguan. Most matched green eyes communicated without words between them. They were broader than the rest of us, with wide shoulders and heavy hands that hung from ropey arms. They were dotted with scars I couldn't bring myself to ask about. They shared one baseball cap between the two of them, changing it from head to head, one day to the next. Slopper was next, the 9-year-old with the belly of a 15-year-old diabetic. His family came from the East Coast. The girls had Wob, who at 18 was practically a woman. She had a vicious, kiloed slash that split her face nearly in two. Then there was Riri, who came from a Metis community close to where my father had said ours used to be, who was old enough to piss in the bush and swear when we played red ass on abandoned brick walls, but who was still a child. Us kids, we longed for the old-timey. We wore our hair in braids to show it. we made sweat lodges out of broken branches, dug back into the earth, covered over with our shirts tied together at the buttonholes. Those lodges weren't very hot, but we sat in them for hours and willed the sweat to pop over our willowy arms and hairless cheeks. It's time for story. Mig exhaled smoke as he spoke. I watched the word story puff over the fire and spread into the accumulative haze that smelled of ground roots and acrid burnt just above our dark heads. Slopper struggled to his feet and started over to his tent. The youngest weren't privy to a story, not yet anyway. Riri made the face she pulled out when she wanted something, like an extra piece of camp bread or to sleep in my tent so I could tell her stories to keep the nightmares away. Mig just looked at her, lifted one eyebrow higher than the other. "Aw, Mig, can I stay for a little bit?" She received no answer and kicked rocks all the way to her tent. The woods grew quiet now. Even the beetles stopped rubbing their smooth shells on softened bark. Even the wind picked around the branches instead of rattling straight through. Mig leaned in so that the fire illuminated his face from the bottom like unsteady stage lights. He opened a hand, palm down to indicate the ground, this ground, as he began story. Well, that's chapter 2, and so far, that chapter was only 4 pages, but we learned a little bit about the group. We learned about each character a little bit, and so Mig is pretty much like the leader of the group. He's the one that keeps it intact, but the little kids, they aren't allowed to hear the story, so that was why Riri and Slobber, they had to go back to the tent. I think, honestly, I think in the future, in the book, I think Mig is going to let Riri stay for a story or be there for a story because she asked for it on this last page here, and like he wouldn't let her, but I'm foreshadowing that he's gonna let her stay for a story one time. Chapter 3, Story, Part 1. Anishinaabe people, us, lived on these lands for 1,000 years. Some of our brothers decided to walk as far east as they could go. Some walked west. Some crossed great stretches of narrow earth until they reached other parts of the globe. Many of us stayed here. We welcomed visitors. We renamed the land Canada. Sometimes things got real between us and the newcomers. Sometimes we killed each other. We were great fighters, warriors. We called ourselves and each other. We knew these lands, so we kicked a lot of ass. Boys also puffed out their chests when Mig got to this part. The women straightened their spines and elongated their necks, their beautiful faces like flowers opening in the heat of the fire. But we lost a lot, mostly because we got sick with new germs. And then when we were on our knees with fever and pukes, they decided they liked us there on our knees. That's when they opened the first schools. We suffered there. We almost lost our languages. Many lost their innocence, their laughter, their lives. But we got through it, and the schools were shut down. We returned to our home places and rebuilt, relearned, regrouped. We picked up and carried on. There were a lot of years where we lost too much pain, drowned in forgetting that came in convenient packages, bottles, pills, cubicles where we settled to move around papers, where we sang our songs and brought them to the streets and into the classrooms. Classrooms were built on our own lands and filled with our own words and books. And once we remembered that we were warriors, once we honored the pain and left it on the side of the road, we moved ahead. We were back. Minerva drew in a big wet sniff, wiped her nose across her sleeve, and then sat about chewing the fabric once more. Then the words for the water came. America reached up and started sipping on our lakes with a great metal straw. Where were the fresh lakes and the clean servers? On our lands, of course. On the Anishinaabe were always the cannery in the mine for the rest of them.
the harbor.
Too bad the country was busy worrying about how we didn't pay an extra tax on Levi's jeans and take down the bars to listen to what we were shouting.
Yeah.
The Great Lakes were polluted to muck. It took some doing, but right around the time California was swallowed back by the ocean, they were fenced off, too poisonous for use. I'd seen the Great Lakes, Ontario when we were in the city, and Huron when we lived on the New Road allowance. The waters were gray and thick like porridge. In the distance, anchored ships swam, silent and shuddered, back and forth on the roll of methodic waves. The water wars raged on, moving north seeking our rivers and bays, and eventually, once our homelands were decimated, the water leached and the people scattered. They moved on to the towns. Only then were armies formed, soldiers drafted, and bullets fired. Ironically, at the same time, rivers were being sucked south and then east to the highest bidder. The north was melting. The melt put most of our northlands underwater, and the people moved south or onto some of the thousands of tiny islands that popped up out of the melt's wake across the top of our lands. Those northern people, they were tough. Some of the toughest we've ever had. So they were okay. Are still okay, the tales tell. Some better than okay. That's why we moved north towards them now. Mig stood, pacing his story pace, waving his arms like a slow-motion conductor to place emphasis and tone over us all. We needed to remember story. It was his job to set the memory in perpetuity. He spoke to us every week. Sometimes story was focused on one area, like the first residential schools, where they were, what happened there when they closed. Other times he told us 100 years in one long narrative, blunt and without detail. Sometimes we gathered for an hour so he could explain treaties. Another, it was 10 minutes to list the earthquakes in the sequence that they occurred, peeling the edging off the continents back like diseased gums. But every week we spoke because it was imperative that we know. We said it was the only way to make the kind of changes that were necessary to really survive. A general has to see the whole field to make good strategy, he explained. When you're down there fighting, you can't see much past the threat directly in front of you. The water wars lasted 10 years, before a new set of treaties and agreements were shook on between world leaders in echoing assembly halls. The Anishinaabe were scattered, lonely and scared. On our knees again, only this time there was no home to group at. Meanwhile, the rest of the continent sank into a new era. The world's edges had been clipped by the rising waters, tectonic shifts, and constant rains. Half the population was lost in the disaster from the disease that spread from too many corpses and not enough graves. The ones that were left no better off, really. They worked longer hours, they stopped reproducing without the doctors, and worst of all, they stopped dreaming. Families, loved ones were torn apart in this new world. He stopped suddenly, the fire bouncing over the planes of his face, something so sad it hurt to look in his eyes. And then the rain started again. He couldn't continue, couldn't walk us into the darker parts of the story. Not now. Enough for tonight then. He packed up what lay about while the fire still burned, carrying the tarp we used as a dining room table over the tents. I heard her call. French. I sighed and dropped my shoulders, still smiling. Yeah, Ree, can't sleep. This was fast becoming the routine. I heard stories she did not. She would ask me to tell her stories innocently enough, but desperate for some understanding, the understanding that was withheld from her youth, so that she could form into a real human before she understood that some saw her as little more than a crop. Be there in a minute, okay? I pegged the tarp between Riri's and Minerva's tent so that they'd have a little covered walkway should they have to use the washroom during the rainy night. I carried over the clean latrine bucket and a smaller bucket half filled with water for washing up. Then I took the boots off at the door and I joined Riri in her tent. Until last month, she shared a tent with Minerva, but she was getting older and had demanded some space, which was granted. We'd encourage independence in our family. We never knew when anyone would be on their own, even at 7. The tent was small, and the firelight from outside made everything the same red as the vinyl walls. She had made a nest of her blankets in the middle on top of her blue-ground tarp, away from the walls that could hold condensation and spread dampness in a good enough downpour. I lay down beside her on top of the blankets. Her pillow was like all of ours, a case stuffed with folded clothes. There was no room for extras in the camp. Everything did double duty. Before I'd even laid my head down, she was after story. Tell me what happened, French, please. Ree, you know I can't tell you. But why? Why can't I know? She lifted herself up on an elbow, bleeding. It's no fair. I get sent away all the time. I rolled over onto my back, reaching up to tap the raggedy dream catcher I'd bent out of branches filled with vines for her, so that it swung on its string. It's for your own good. She squinted at me in the red gloom. That's a load of bull. I deserve to know my own history. It was getting more difficult to reason with her, especially when she made sense. Riri had just been a baby when I joined the camp, newly walking and bucket trained. For some reason, she quickly grew attached to me. Mig thought I must have reminded her of someone from her original family. Whatever the reason, I often had a chubby shadow throughout my day. Now that she was a real kid with her own duties and her own mind, it's becoming increasingly hard to relegate her to the shadows and to ignore her requests for information or background to her difficult life. Slopper was allowed to hear a story when he was younger. I began. What? That's not fair. She was up on her knees in a flash. How come he got to hear? Relax. I pushed her shoulder, trying to get her to lie down. Listen to me, please. I stopped talking until she grudgingly lay back on her side, facing me. Slopper was allowed to hear a story a couple of years ago, when he was your age. He didn't even hear all of it, and it didn't turn out so well. But I'm not Slopper French. She had sprung back up. I can handle it. I'm mature for my age. I laughed at this. I know that's true, Ree. You're practically a grown-ass lady. She pursed her lips, checking my face for mockery. When she found none, she gave me a stiff. Thank you. But it's about timing. Mig will let you know the whole story when it's time. Slopper was pretty messed up for months after. He stopped playing, didn't want to learn anything, and even stopped sleeping so good. She was finally quiet. I watched the dream catcher spin to a stop. I remember following Mitch around, bugging him for any details he might know as we tromped after my parents to the bay. I thought about the parts Mig had left out the night, the parts that kept us running, even still. It was unfair to keep everything from me. It had driven me to a distraction to not know, made it harder to keep moving day after day without understanding what was on our heels. I think maybe I can share some things though. Her eyes grew big, but she held back her words. Years ago, other people, not us, they kind of got us sick. Really, the whole world itself got sick. I tiptoed around the harsher images that came to mind. Like it never used to rain all the time, and there were way more people. After the rain started and the land shifted, so that some cities fell right into the oceans, people had to move around. Diseases spread like crazy. With all this sickness and movement and death, people got sad. One of the ways the sadness came out was when they slept. They stopped being able to dream. At first, they just talked about it, all casual, like, oh, funniest thing, I haven't dreamed in months. Isn't that odd? I haven't dreamed either. Here, I pinched my voice high and wiggled my shoulder to imitate a mincing kind of movement, like how I imagine white ladies did as they pushed metal carts down along the straight aisles to gather food from boxes lined up on shelves, all of it already dead. Riri smiled at this impression. They visited their head doctors, psychiatrists. They took pills to help them sleep when they stopped having the will to lie down at night. Soon they turned on each other, and the world changed again. A low whistle was fluttering and sounding outside. The alarm. I jumped up. Where are you going? Riri sounded frantic. She just started to hear the story, and now I was leaving. Gotta go. Something is coming. I dashed out of the tent, stepping into my boots with the laces still undone. The rest of the group, with the exception of Slopper, was around the low fire. Big acknowledged me with a look, and then sought out Chiboy with his eyes. He motioned with his head to the east of our sight, keeping in a crouch and hurrying to the trees. We were out in the open. It was too late to run or hide. We'd have to fight. Chiboy pulled his long blade out from the sheath where it hung at his belt and backed into the trees until the shadows covered him completely. I needed to help. I grabbed a long stick from the fires, and glowing with orange heat scales, and waited. My hands shook so the stick clattered a bit against the rock perimeter of the fire. Wob had crept over to the crouch in front of Minerva. She nodded at me, and I scanned the forest behind them. Sweat dripped down the bridge of my nose. I blinked as if that would relieve its slow, maddening itch. Then I heard it. Footsteps in the bush. Not heavy steps, light and cautious, just like a recruiter on the prowl. I raised the stick behind me like a bat, pulling it up over like a sword. I could hear the sizzle of the lit tip by my ear. Closer. I swallowed hard and almost coughed, catching it at the last minute so that my eyes teared up. I heard Mig Owl call to Cheeboy, who answered with deep silence. Closer. Steps were slow but steady. I picked up the swoosh of a drag, like a bag or maybe a body. Maybe we weren't the first camp to be discovered. I could swear I saw the branches moving in the trees, just past the second row beyond our clearing. Come on, Goof, come and get it, I whispered, tossing my weight between the balls of my feet, trying to be brave. Closer. Now I saw Mig sidestepping between the first and second rows, his feet silent in their patched-up shoes. Why was he out in the open like that? Maybe he was playing decoy? Should I start rounding up the others to run? My breathing got louder and the footsteps stopped. Shit. Could they hear my fear? Did I give us away? What the hell? A high-pitched yell, and then 2 seconds later, Cheeboy emerged, dangling a girl by her forearm from this height. Let go of me. She was spinning and kicking, and I'm pretty sure spitting. Cheeboy pulled her out of the shadows and dropped her in front of the fire, a foot from where I stood with the dry stick raised behind my head. Mig emerged next with a large green duffel bag. Jesus, holy God, you scared me. She was angry. Her eyes swung around the circle, taking it to the fire of the tents and the people. Then she found me. What in the hell are you doing? Posing for a goddamn Hall of Fame statue? She rubbed her arm where Cheeboy held her. Mig carefully put her bag by her feet and took a few steps back. I lowered my stick and speared the ground over and over. Some welcome, she glanced at us. I lost enough adrenaline to notice the way her cheeks held shadows by her eyes were clear. One thought jumped into my head. Please don't let her be my cousin. Please. So that was the end of the third chapter. The people in the group were told a story by Mig, and Riri isn't allowed to hear the story, so she asked that French give her a little bit of the story and give her a little bit of information, because he understands how hard it is to keep moving and running from something that you don't understand or you don't have information. Like, why are you running from something if you don't know what it is? Also, we got introduced a new character in the book. Once the alarm went off, Cheeboy found what set off the alarm, and that was like a girl. He came out of the bush dangling her from her forearm. At the end, he says, Fred says, please don't let her be my cousin, please. I think he's gonna try to get with her. So, chapter 4, Magic Words. Rose had been with us for about 3 weeks before she fully settled in, putting up her tent beside ours, sharing food without suspicion, and even laughing this big. Throaty laugh she had that filled all the space, and although she hadn't shared her coming to story yet, I knew enough about her to know we were not blood related. Thank God, because she made me feel like I needed to be a better person just through her existing. She was a fighter and became more vocal about it every day. We were used to her outbursts during story. In fact, she became part of story. The dissenting voice to the way things are. The rebel waiting for the fight to be brought. We loved the way she rebelled. Anyway, having been raised by old people, she spoke like them. Made us feel surrounded on both ends. Like we had a furniture and a past all bundled up in her round dark cheeks and loose curls. It was a beautiful night in that time of year when the bugs go to sleep, so we stayed together by the fire instead of slipping into our tent. Rose was moody and made a sudden declaration into the quiet. We should go after the government assholes ourselves. No more running. She threw her hands out. The fire made the shadows of her fingers into a huddle of people against the trees. Old Minerva watched the new shadow people slowly clapping her hands at their firelight jigging. Mig poked the fire. We'd survived this before. We will survive it again. Trust that there is always someone who has taken the greater good as a mission. Mig squashed his dying smoke under his heel and stretched out his legs, making a pillow between his head and the log with his hands. Beside him, Minerva was now beginning to snore, her head slumped to her shoulder, a ball of string clutched in her hand. Rose sat back down, and we slowly paced our limbs into sleep positions under the wide sky. Someone better come up with a plan soon, by the Jesus, or I'll make one. She said it more to herself than to any of us. I watched her eyes deep and reflective, her lips moving with whispers about action and the people and all the damn world itself. I'd never seen anyone who looked like Rose before. She said she got her looks from having a black father, her small, wide nose, her dark, severe bones. I think it had more to do with her stubbornness and the way it got caught up in her eyebrows and dimples when she was overthinking something. When she closed her lids over those mirror eyes, I turned to the woods and invited the dreams in, hoping they'd include the last face I memorized in profile. You boys need to work on your hunting. But there's no animals around here, Mig. Mig put his hands on his skinny hips and sighed, shaking his head down as he exhaled. Doesn't matter. They'll be back and you need to be ready. Besides, maybe if you were better at hunting, you'd catch one of the dozen or so animals that are around here. He was addressing Slopper, who kicked rocks with the toe of his beat-up Converse. We stood in the trees in a circle around Mig, who was loading his gun while he gave up the charge for the day. We did this every second or third day, depending on the weather. Sometimes it was hunting, others it was shelter building. Mig said it was apocalyptic Boy Scouts. We didn't know what in the hell he was talking about, but we liked fashioning bows and arrows and whooping to each other through the bush and feeling all chiefy. We took turns splitting into groups hunting in Homestead, switching off every 3 months. The homesteaders were back at the campsite, packing up for the next slide northward, and watching Minerva, who had been braiding Riri's hair and tapping out a tune on the top of her head, pause when we left them. We were lucky. We had Meg to learn from instead of Minerva to babysit. We clambered out of the camp, all elbows and bravado, feeling our superiority, owning our luck. Rose, her massive curls tangled on her head in a sloppy bun, shot me a look from the tent as she was dismantling, having been stuck with homesteaders. I watched my feet navigate the tripwires we'd set up yesterday and avoided her disdain. You got to know how to tell animals are nearby. How would you do that? Anyone? Slopper's hand shot up, exposing his round belly hanging out of the bottom of his shrinking t-shirt. All of our clothes got worn to dust. It was rare to come across anything out here. And even if we did, you had to wear the new boots or hold sweater a few weeks before you forgot a dead man had worn it. I had lucked into a pair of fleece-lined army pants 2 winters past. They had been frozen to a low branch where someone must have left them to dry. I rolled them 3 times on each leg and kept them with a rope forever. Just this season, I'd finally been able to let them hang to their full weight, because I had pants and a coat and even gloves, with only 2 fingers worn to skin. All clothes were passed on to the others. Soon enough, I would be looking for new pants, and the goods would go my way first. Mig tried not to sigh, but he did a little. Yes, Slopper? You see them? Okay, Slopper. They're close enough for you to see them. There better already be a bullet or an arrow on the way to take them down. Anyone else have any ideas on how we can track them to get close enough to shoot? Cheeboy answered. Ground marks. Okay, like what? Shit. My face got hot when the others laughed. That's right. Frenchie, if you see shit on the ground, you know the asshole who dropped it must be close. Mig's response brought fresh peals of laughter, including my own. You can also tell by its, freshness, how long ago the animal was at that spot. Anything else? We spent the morning talking and looking at examples of trees gored by shedding antlers and branches snapped by lumbering bodies. Wild led us through the bush, trying to demonstrate the movements required to take prey by surprise. It was after midday when we began the walk back to the camp with a couple of rabbits and 1 patchy furred animal for lunch before an afternoon march to the next bunking. I was walking with Slopper and Cheeboy. We were singing a song we'd made up to an old-timey round dance double beat. Cheeboy had a beautiful high voice, and when he sang, he squinted his already small eyes to slits. It made him look like the friendliest giant in the forest. I loved watching him sing. Slopper hammed it up a bit, trying to mimic and trying to pretend that wasn't the case. Way, hey, yo, way, ha. I don't know where we're going. Don't know where we've been. Way, hey, all I know is I'll keep walking. can't get taken in. Way, hey, yeah. We sang it around and around in our warbling voices somewhere between youth and where they would settle, like bees around a single flower. We were delirious with it, tossing the chords back and forth between us like a ball, making up new lyrics as we grew bored with the old ones. Mig was oddly quiet. Usually at about 16th time, he'd snap at us to shut it. Today, he just kept 2 paces ahead. He didn't even yell at the twins for lagging behind to pick up interesting-looking rocks for their growing collection. Maybe you should collect feathers instead of rocks. It's not the smartest collection when you're on the run, he told them more than once. I jogged up to meet his pace. Hey, Mig, what's up? He kept cadence and didn't answer for a full minute. Birds are too quiet. Maybe they went ahead. But why? We came into the camp from the east, stepping over the wires and ducking under the hanging bells. The homesteaders had almost everything ready for the move, stacked and tied in one pile. There was just a dinner fire glowing, and the people themselves sitting on the fallen logs we dragged around the pit like they'd been waiting all day for our lazy asses to get back. I searched the faces for Rose. When I found her, I looked away and then just happened to stumble over to her log to sit. Meg handed the catch to Wob. As the only woman in the bunch, other than crazy old Minerva, management of the cooking fell in her domain. Not that she had to cook everything herself, just that she got to say who did it and how. As a woman of the group, she was in charge of the important things. Even though she'd hunted that day, she decided to take care of things herself. Wob gathered her long bleach hair into a ponytail, looked us over once with her small dark eyes, and then sat about skinning the animals on a flat rock with her beloved blade. She looked like this solitary work, her fingers catching and releasing, pulling and knotting in old rhythms, especially having to mentor the hunters. I felt Rose on the log beside me. It's like the shape of her body heat fit right into me, and I couldn't ignore her for long. I feel bad for you guys. What? Why? Rose was all aggression out of the gate. She turned to look at me, her curly hair wild around her face, half tucked into her small parka. Well, because we get to learn from Mig and you guys are stuck with that. I pointed with my lips across the fire to Minerva, who was absorbed and chewing through a bag of porcupine quills she'd harvested last week, and when we ran across its carcass. I hate when it's my turn for homesteaders, so it's so useless. Stuck with Minerva, huh? You have no idea. She leaned forward, her elbows on her thighs. Our knees were almost touching. As bad as that, I commiserated, glad to have something to talk about, glad that she leaned into me doing so. No, not bad at all. As a matter of fact, being with Minerva is pretty Nishan. She narrowed her eyes. Uh-oh. Nishan? What in the hell is that? Oh, nothing. Just a little of the language. I jumped up. Bullshit. She jumped up too, throwing her shoulder into mine. Not bullshit, real shit. How do you have language? My voice broke on the last syllable. My chest tightened. How could she have the language? She was the same age as me, and I deserved it more. I don't know why, but I felt certain that I did. I yanked my braid out of the back of my shirt and let it fall over my shoulder. Some kind of proof, I suppose. She pushed her face into mine, and for the first time I didn't think about kissing her. I didn't notice then, but would recall later that she had cut bangs into her hair that day. They had fell a little lower on the left side, and that she had to brush them out of her eye. Minerva has the language, and us poor guys are stuck with her, so we learn. She used her fingers to put air quotes around poor guys. Then she used the same fingers to push me in my chest. I had to turn away. I had to walk out towards the perimeter of the clearing, into the darkness of the branches, because I wasn't sure if I was going to cry or scream. I didn't want her to witness either. Hey, Frenchie, don't go far there. We need to get some rest now. We're heading out on the first light. Mig called back to the fire. I hunkered down into my sleeping spot as soon as we finished our meal, before even the first stars ripped through the black. Nishan, Nishan, Nishan. I turned the word over in my throat like a stone, a prayer I couldn't add to, a world I wasn't willing to release. Made my lungs feel heavy. My heart grew light until the juxtaposition of the two phased into sleep. I couldn't yell. I had no voice to make noise with. All I could do was watch and shake my head from the tree-walled Down below on the overground lawn, Mitch waved up at me, all happy and carefree. Behind him, 6 recruiters crept forward in a semicircle, trapping my brother between them and the dense trees in which I was hiding. I pleaded with him with my eyes. I had to hold on to the trunk with everything I had. I knew that if I didn't, I'd fall and Mitch would be angry. I tried to lift just one hand so I could point to the recruiters, now barely 6 feet away, but as soon as I loosened a finger, I started to slide and Mitch's face grew dark. I just had to. Couldn't let them take him again. Pulled my left hand free, started pointing like crazy. Mitch was upset and he called me, "No, Frenchie, hold on. For God's sake, hold on, Frenchie. You hear me? Frenchie. Frenchie." Someone shook me awake with the toe of their boot. "Get up. We gotta go now." I woke up sweating, Ziguan standing over me, his brother Cherie slightly behind him. They'd hit a growth spurt this past summer. It made their almost consistent silence a little more intimidating. My sleeping bag was wedged between my legs in a sweaty twist of polyester and anxiety. Yeah, okay. I wiped the sweat from my eyes and sat up. Kids were already shouldering their packs. Meg was pouring water on the pit. I took a piss in the bushes and rolled up my gear fast. "Let's go. We need to make ground today." Meg's eyes were squinty and we moved faster than our usual pace. Minerva and little Riri were relieved of their baggage to give them a bit of an advantage so they could keep up. A 7-year-old and a 1,000-year-old need as much of an advantage as they can get, I suppose. We had walked for almost an hour before I felt the last fingers of the dream loosen from my lower back. The sun was warm this morning, even as we edged further north and further into the season. It means good. It was Rose. She'd caught up to me, even with the added weight of Riri's roll attached to her own with a fraying bungee cord. I looked at her, a question in my eyes. "Nishan, it means good." I kept my eyes on the trail ahead. I didn't mean to, but I said it anyways. So, she said, "if you want to know what Minerva tells us, I'll share." I took 3 strides before I could answer. Okay. Yeah, okay. She punched my arm. I couldn't help but smile. I wanted to say her name, to feel it rumble past my teeth. "Yeah, Rose, that sounds Nishan." So that's the end of chapter 4. Let's see. So let's see. Meg takes the group out hunting, and they got a small catch. Slopper asked a pretty stupid question in the story. Like, Meg asked them how, an animal's close, and Slopper asked, "You see them?" And, it's the right answer, but it's a stupid answer. Rose got a little bit of language from Minerva, and French feels that he should have gotten the language before her because he feels that he's earned it. Rose agrees to give him the language that she knows, and French likes her, and that gives him the opportunity to spend more time with her and also learn the language. So I feel like later on in the book, Rose and French are going to get closer because of this, because of the language connection that they have. Haunted in the bush. For a week, I'd had trouble sleeping. I wanted to see Mitch and my parents when I closed my eyes, but not in the way they had been coming to me as of late. Mom showing up in my tent with her mouth sewn shut and her left arm missing. Dad sitting by the fire, drinking out of a mason jar, then jumping into the flames. When I got close enough to smell the moose hide of its mitts, I spent a lot of time with Riri. She took full advantage of my resistance to sleep. "Where did you walk from?" "The outer city." "Did the recruiters chase you?" "They would have. My brother stopped them." "Did your brother get taken?" "Yeah, Riri. He got taken." "What did he look like?" "He seemed really big, but I don't think he was. I think maybe he was just always bigger than me. He had eyes that were blue sometimes but looked gray. And his hair was almost black. His teeth were crooked so that the front ones looked like they were holding hands." It was painful, but I didn't really mind. The more I described my brother, my parents, our makeshift community before Dad left with the council, the more I remembered, like the way my uncle jigged to heavy metal. Instead of dreaming their tragic forms, I recreated them as living, laughing people in the cool red confines of Riri's tent as she drifted off. I woke up with stiff muscles and frozen toes on her tarp one morning, her small form huddled under layers, cheeks pink with warmth and rest. I must have fallen asleep in the middle of talking the night before. I could see my breath and hear the near constant rain pattering on the vinyl walls, a slow, steady drizzle. That's the best we could hope for these days. Mig couldn't explain the science of it. But ever since the north started melting, there were more rains. I shook the damp out of my legs and laced my boots back on, wrapping the tops in strips of fabric that tore as I knotted them. Almost time to replace them. Thank God I was done for the last growth spurt. I'd ended up having to wear flip-flops for weeks. They were the only thing that fit until we scavenged a foreign, forgotten lodge and found the boots I wore now. Outside, Wob and Cheeboy were already packing up her tent. She moved away from him when I came out, and he shuffled off to fold up his own tent, leaving her to wind the rope and store her pegs. Something about their movements, choppy and stilted, made me feel awkward. I tried to fill the space with words. Good morning. Hey Wob, start breakfast yet? Twins are on meal duty. They are homesteaders. Oh right, I forgot it was hunting day. Yippee, more squirrel and mushroom stew. She didn't answer and said she gave me a wry look, then started braiding up her hair as she watched Cheeboy work. Not that I don't like your stew, it's just, thankfully I was interrupted when Slopper farted loud and long from his tent. We couldn't help but laugh. Christ, sounds like that one ripped a hole in the ground, one of the twins shouted from the main latrine. Behind it, a dense thicket, chuckles could be heard from Mig's and Minerva's tents. Gross. Ree was up. With that introduction to the new day, the camp came to life, one by one brushing their teeth with brushes, worn to stiff nubs, beating the wet out of clothes by slapping them against trucks and running tight circles around the perimeter to warm up. We sat in a quiet circle, packing our gear and waiting for food. The hunters strapped on the wrist watches we shared. Mig didn't need one. He kept a pocket watch in his jeans. It was important for the hunters to keep time so we could keep track of each other during the day. We never used to need these things, Mig commented as we wound the mechanisms and checked that they were synchronized. But no one has the skill of teaching time by the sky here. Maybe one day we'll run into someone who does. Then we won't have to rely on these things no more. The twins opened a few tins of condensed milk, handing the empty cans to Minerva, who rinsed them out in a puddle. She smiled while she cleaned the lids and pulled them off, stashing them in the leather crossbody bag she wore every day. Who knew what she was up to? Minerva collected odd things. We didn't even question it anymore. Mig crushed the tins as small as they could go so we could bury them along with our minimal garbage by the latrine. After a hasty breakfast of mush, the hunters were off, eager to take advantage of the halt in the rain and the appearance of sliced sunlight throughout the striated clouds. It is often necessary to break up a larger group to achieve a goal, especially since a lone shadow can get into more spots without notice than a larger group. We were a 50-minute hike from the camp. I want you all to get used to the idea of operating alone. Mig was crouched down in the middle of our huddle, checking the ground for fresh prints. There are signs of deer in this area, maybe something bigger. If we work separately but together, we should bring back a nice buck. Woohoo! Slopper pumped his fist in the air, being a huge fan of fresh deer meat. But only, continued Mig, looking at the excited boy, if we can stay quiet and focused. Slopper lowered his fist and shuffled his feet. Mig stood, put his hands on his lower back, and stretched. We're going to each go our separate ways, so make sure you keep track of which direction you walk. Cross twigs on the paths when you change directions, find your way back without tipping off potential predators, and have your weapons ready. Cheeboy and Wob were carrying bows. Slopper, not having graduated to full hunter status, carried a sharpened stick. Mig had his .45 and I had the rifle slung over my shoulder. Cheeboy used to carry the rifle, but he and Wob had been spending time relearning bow hunting, so it fell to me now. Bows are sustainable. Eventually we won't be able to get more bullets, and at least I can make arrows, he'd explained. I think they just liked having this thing they shared in common, never mind all the hours it provided them alone to practice. Everyone goes a different way. Keep a steady but mindful pace, the same speed we keep on the trail when we move camp. An hour's walk, no more. Then you find a lookout and wait. Mig reloaded his handgun and tucked it back in his waistband. With his long raincoat with the popped up collar and the 45 is in his wide leather belt. The Four Winds. We headed northwest up towards the shallows of James Bay, where the whales used to migrate before they packed up and headed down to Australia for good. After the Indians left, the industries and business and around their territories closed up to small-time fisheries, hunting camps, tourist traps. After that, the big ones started to fall. Large-scale resorts, fly-in luxury cottages, wilderness getaways for stressed businessmen and forgotten investors. In light of the wars and the rush to adapt and survive, no one really gave a shit about tourism, gross domestic profit, or low-level jobs for rurally located folks, though they cared enough to kick everyone out when the former employees tried to bunk down in the one-plush rooms and make us use of the supplies and heat. They fenced them off, boarded them up, and some even hired security firms to walk around the perimeter and make sure no one was looking to survive on corporate-sponsored vacancy. This is where we were now, up against the high fences surrounding the Four Winds Resort. According to the Fox Marble sign at the end of the weed-cracked driveway on the other side, 10, maybe 12 feet, She-Boy was eyeing at the top of the fence. Razor wire edging, electric charge mechanism. I doubt they're still electrified. That would mean the generator still worked. Mig sounded more hopeful than he looked. Only one way to find out, I suppose. Mig put his pack sack on the ground, pulled the sash off his forehead, and let his bedroll drop behind his feet. He spit into his palms and rubbed them together. Okay, he took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. I saw what he meant to do. He nudged his bedroll out of the way and took a few steps back, shaking out his arms, rolling his head on the stem of his neck. Shit, rose his like a recoiling snake. Her hand reached to cover Riri's eyes in anticipation of Mig dancing on the electric jig, sizzling like a piece of frying meat. I saw it in She-Boy's face, the way he suddenly looked young. I saw it in Minerva's eyes before they snapped shut behind wrinkles clutched like fat fists. I felt it in my own pulse. Mig was too important to lose. We couldn't manage without him, and yet there he was, about to take a run at a potentially electrified fence, so that way we could be sheltered and fed for another night. I locked my eyes on Rose, on that bowed cord of vein, muscles that curved from her earlobe down to her neck to her collarbone, and took a quick step to the right and forward. Before Mig could start his run, before I could lose my nerve, I reached out and took 2 chain links in my fingers. I felt the electricity enter my hand, shoot up my arm, and land like a ball of hornets in my aorta. I swear I did, but it was just adrenaline, because there were no sparks, no smell.